All the time, young prospects, returning champions, local favorites, players the tournament wants to spotlight. But this one felt different. Because it wasn't just a sporting decision anymore. It had become a signal. Berlin wasn't treating Alex Aya like a guest passing through the draw. They were treating her like someone the tournament wanted to build around. And that shift changes everything in tennis. Not on paper, but in atmosphere. Because the moment a player becomes central to a tournament's identity, whether through crowd energy, media attention, or emotional pull, the environment around them starts to move differently. Press conferences feel louder. Practice courts feel more watched. Every appearance becomes a moment, not just a routine. And Aya was stepping into that kind of space for the first time in her career. What makes it even more striking is the timing. She didn't arrive in Berlin riding a perfect wave of dominance. She arrived carrying the emotional residue of Birmingham, matches that tested her physically and mentally, a loss to a friend at Queen's Club that reminded her how thin the margins are at this level, and the growing reality that every tournament now carries consequences beyond just 1 week. Ranking points, Wimbledon seeding, draw difficulty, long-term positioning, everything connected. Nothing isolated. That's the quiet pressure elite tennis players live with, and Berlin sits right at the center of it. Because this isn't just another stop. It's the final checkpoint before Wimbledon seeding locks in. Which means every match matters twice. Once for the tournament. Once for the summer that follows. And then comes the moment that reframes everything you're describing. The press conference. The podium. The photograph. A simple object held up in front of cameras that have seen Grand Slam champions and political statements and decades of tennis history. But this wasn't any of those things. It was personal history, a fragment of the Berlin Wall era, a symbol of division, painted over with a flag that represented hope rather than separation. And when Marcus Soke revealed that he had painted it himself as a student, the entire room shifted, not because of nostalgia, but because of meaning. Because what he was really saying, without saying it directly, was this: I know what it feels like to come from somewhere that doesn't guarantee you anything. And now I see you. That's why the emotional reaction wasn't performative. It wasn't media spectacle. It was recognition meeting experience. And for Alex Aya, who has spent her entire career navigating questions of belonging, legitimacy, and scale, that recognition lands differently. Not as praise, but as permission. Permission to be seen not just as a story in progress, but as someone already shaping the space she enters. And that's why Berlin feels unlike anything that came before it. Because by the time she steps onto court there, she is no longer just responding to opponents. She is responding to something bigger. Expectation, history, and belief from places she never asked for it, but now carries anyway. And that's where this stops being just a tennis story. Because the question isn't whether she belongs in Berlin. The question is what happens when a player starts to feel like she belongs everywhere she goes. All the time. But this one felt different almost immediately because the field Ella was walking into wasn't soft. 9 of the world's top 10 players were in that draw. Music, Aina Sabalina, Elena Rybakina, Coco Gauff, Jessica Pagula. Music, the freshly crowned French Open champion Mara Andreeva. This wasn't a gentle entry point. This was the deep end of the pool. Music. And yet, the moment her name appeared in that draw, something remarkable happened. Ticket sales moved. Not a little. They moved the way they always move when Alex Ella shows up somewhere. Because by this point in 2026, the tennis world had a name for it, the Yele effect. Music, you want to talk about the Yele effect? Let's talk about it because it is genuinely one of the most fascinating phenomena in modern sport. In Dubai, tick back to what happens next. Because in tennis, and in sport more broadly, emotion doesn't win matches. It changes the atmosphere. It changes perception. It changes pressure. But it doesn't change the scoreboard. And that's where Berlin becomes something more complicated than a story about welcome or symbolism or even history. Because after the cameras go down, after the press conference clips finish circulating, after the crowd outside the venue finally disperses in the rain and flags are folded and carried home,
she still has to play.
Donna Veiki is still on the other side of the net. And none of what happened at the podium alters the fact that Veiki has a serve, a return game, Patterns on grass that have been built through years of repetition at this level. That's the quiet truth underneath every emotional sports moment. The match remains untouched. And that's what makes this stage so interesting. Because Alexia is now carrying something most players never have to carry at this scale. Not just expectation from her own team. Not just ranking pressure. Not just Wimbledon's seeding implications. But emotional investment from two publics at once. Her home country and a second country that has, in real time, emotionally adopted her story. That kind of attention doesn't directly help you hit a forehand. But it changes everything around the act of hitting it. It makes every point feel observed, not just by fans, but by narrative. And narrative is heavy. Still, if you strip all of that away, the flags, the photograph, the viral moment, you come back to the simplest competitive reality. She has beaten Vaki before.
Twice.
Which matters in a way that emotion never fully replaces. Because repetition builds reference points. And reference points build confidence. So when she walks out onto that grass in Berlin, she is not just stepping into a symbolic moment. She is stepping into a known matchup, with known outcomes and known pressure patterns. That is where elite sport lives. Between story and repetition. Between meaning and execution. And Berlin, at this point in your narrative, is doing something very specific. It is forcing both worlds to collide at once. The emotional world that says this is bigger than tennis, and the competitive world that says it is only tennis. And Alexia is standing exactly at that intersection. Not as a symbol, not as a guest, but as a player who now has to answer the only question that ultimately survives every press conference, every viral moment, every standing ovation. When the first ball is struck, can you still play your game when none of it matters anymore? ET sales jumped 48% when she entered the draw. 48%. That's not a coincidence. That's a player changing the commercial reality of a tournament just by being there. In Indian Wales, Filipino fans from across California turned what is normally a very American tournament experience into something that looked and sounded like a Manila street party. In Birmingham, 25,000 fans packed into center court for her matches, and 70% of the tickets for the final were purchased by Filipinos. People who flew in, drove in, planned their entire schedule around watching one woman compete. Berlin was next, and Berlin was ready. Within hours of Ella's wild card being confirmed, the Filipino diaspora in Germany, over 150,000 people began organizing. Music group chats lit up, flag orders went out, cheering sections were mapped. The hashtag Alila in Berlin was trending before most of the European tennis media had even finished writing their draw previews. German fans curious about this player they kept hearing about started buying tickets, too. Music, the Rottweil Tennis Club, a venue built on prestige and precision, was about to experience something it had never quite seen before. But music, none of that. Not the ticket sales, not the trending hashtags, not the sea of yellow and blue in the stands. None of it was the story. The story was the man standing at the podium. Marcus Zocchi had been a professional tennis player. That part matters more than you might think, because it means that when he looks at someone like Alex Ella, he's not seeing her through the soft lens of a civilian fan. He's seeing her through the eyes of someone who has stood on those same courts, who has felt that same Sure, who knows what it costs to compete at the highest level of the sport. Music. He reached a career-high ranking of 48 in the world. He won an ADP title in Sun City in 1994. Music. He represented Germany in Davis Cup. He's been on the big stages, Wimbledon, the US Open, the Australian Open, and he has felt the weight of those moments. So when he says he sees something special in a player, it's not a publicity line. It carries the credibility of someone who knows exactly what special looks like up close. He had been watching Ella for years. He watched her dismantle Ice Swiatek at the Miami Open. He watched her capture her first WTA title in Guadalajara. He watched her finally break what Filipino fans had started calling the Czech curse in Birmingham, ending 13 straight losses to players from that country. He watched all of it. And when the time came to build the wild card list for Berlin, Music, he didn't just suggest a name, he fought for it. He went into committee meetings and made the case. He convinced skeptical board members that a player ranked 33 in the world could be the single biggest draw at a tournament stacked with players ranked inside the top 10. He was right. The day her wild card was confirmed, her match slots started selling out. Music, but Zoki wasn't done because there's a difference between doing your job and doing something that costs you something personally. And what Marcus Sui was about to do at that press conference was deeply, unmistakably personal. The room filled up the way press conference rooms do before a big tournament. Music journalists from across Europe, reporters from Asia, camera operators, broadcast crews, the usual controlled chaos of a pre-event media day. Everyone expected the standard rundown, draw analysis, player availability, scheduling, logistics, maybe a quote or two that could be turned into a headline. Music, what they got instead will probably be talked about for a very long time. Zoki went through the administrative items first. He's a professional. He handled the business and then he paused, and the room felt it. There's something about a deliberate pause in a public setting that changes the air. Everyone straightened up a little. Cameras refocused, and Zoki looked across the room, past the press corps, past the broadcast equipment, until his eyes landed on a corner where Alex Ella was sitting, waiting for her own press conference to begin. He said he had one more announcement. He talked about the wild card, about why he gave it to her, about believing she was one of the most exciting young players in the world. And then he said something that nobody in that room was prepared for. He said he believed in something bigger than tennis. He said he believed in the power of sport to bring people together, in the power of an athlete to inspire a nation. He looked directly at her and he said, "Berlin is behind you. Germany is behind you. From this moment forward, you are not just a visitor to our country. Music, you are part of our tennis family." The silence that followed was the kind that doesn't feel empty. Music, it feels full, full of something that's hard to name, but impossible to miss. Journalists looked at each other. Music, cameras pushed in on Ella's face, and you could see her processing it in real time. This 21-year-old, who had already been through more in her short career than most players twice her age. The fines, the disputes, the fitness advisories, the tournament snubs, the long road from junior prodigy to top 50 professional. Music processing the fact that a former ADPP player and tournament director had just publicly said on camera in front of the entire tennis media that Germany was adopting her, but he still wasn't finished. Zoki reached under the podium and lifted a framed photograph. Simple frame, powerful image. The Berlin Wall covered in graffiti music with a single Philippine flag painted across its surface. And then he told them about the photograph. In 1989, he had been an exchange student in West Berlin. The wall was still standing. The city was still divided. And this young German tennis player, far from home, had picked up a can of paint and drawn the Philippine flag on that wall. Not as a political act, not as a stunt, but because he believed even then that walls could fall, that barriers could be broken, that someone from a small country without the traditional advantages, music without the infrastructure or the history or the funding that the tennis powerhouses had, that someone like that could still achieve greatness. He turned to face Ella directly. He told her she was that someone. Music, he told her she was breaking barriers no Filipino had ever broken before, and he said he was personally proud to welcome her to Berlin. What happened next was not the composed professional response you might expect from a seasoned athlete at a media event. Ella stood up. She walked to the podium, and in a voice that was barely above a whisper, she said she didn't know what to say. And Zoki told her she didn't have to say anything.
Just play, he said.
Just fight.
Just be you.
The applause that came after that was not the polite, measured clapping of a press conference room. It was the sound of people who had forgotten for a moment that they were supposed to be professional observers. Journalists who had covered this sport for decades wiped their eyes. Camera operators lowered their equipment. Alexa, who had stared down the WTA leadership and refused to back down, who had signed waivers and fought through fitness concerns and refused to let the politics of the sport break her spirit. She was standing at a podium in Berlin with glistening eyes and trembling hands because a man had shown her a photograph of a flag he painted on a wall before she was even born. The video hit the internet within minutes. Within hours, it had been viewed 30 million times. By the following day, Music, the tennis world had been fundamentally changed in the way that only the most unexpected moments can change it. Berlin Embraces Ella trended at #1 simultaneously in the Philippines, Germany, the United Kingdom, Music, the United States, and Australia. From Manila, fans who had followed every step of her journey were posting through tears. One wrote that a former ADP player had just given Alex a piece of history, a photograph of the Philippine flag on the Berlin Wall, and that he had said, "Berlin is behind you." They said they were crying and not ashamed. German fans, proud of their country's response, added their own voices. One wrote that they had been watching tennis for 40 years and had never seen a tournament director do anything remotely like what Zoki had just done. That Alex Ella represented everything worth loving about sport. The resilience, the refusal to surrender, the insistence on proving that you belong even when every institution around you seems designed to make you doubt it. Tennis analysts, Music, tried to find the right frame for it. One called it diplomacy. Another said it transcended sport entirely. Former players weighed in. Boris Becker, who had already publicly called Ella the next superstar in tennis, said Zoki was a man of integrity and that his gesture was not just about the game, but about humanity. Venus Williams, who was set to partner Ella in doubles at the Bad Hamburg Open, said she had known Marcus for years and that he was not a man who made empty gestures. Coco Gauff, one of Ella's closest friends on tour, posted that she was watching the clip and crying. Music, that a tournament director had just given Alex a piece of the Berlin Wall with a Philippine flag on it, and that what he had said, "Berlin is behind you," was love. That was respect. That was everything. Music, and then, as it always does, the attention turned.